Badarian culture represents something very interesting. It's mainly about cattle and it's mainly about females. And you will notice that the Badarians, they live in such a manner that they have things that come from many, many cultures. One of the cultures that we'll zoom into today is the Pan cultures or the Pangrave culture, as it's called by some historians. They're called the Pangrave culture because they have these graves that are in the shape of a pan, and around the graves are cattle that are painted. Now, obviously, this is weird. Why would this be a thing in that area? But before we look at the Pangraves, let's look specifically at Badarian culture. Located here are Badarian ware that is with a sleeping man, and you can see that the black top that is typical of Nubian is here. The red base is typical, the openness of the base, but you can see that it is located in Egypt and it represents the cultural continuity that is Nubians in Egypt. Now, of course, I'm only separating these because the black top, red bottom pots are usually associated with Nubia, although in a realistic point of view, because they're in Egypt, they should be considered Egyptian. But I have to separate these for the sake of this video. About 4000 BC in Upper Egypt, we see this burial or these findings from a burial, and we see, of course, this clay pot. We see, not even shown in this picture, we know that there's other things that are associated with Nubia, but the pot itself is enough to say, okay, this must have been a Nubian site. The Nubian site is interesting again for a couple reasons, because it predates the culture that I'm talking about, the Pangrave culture, by about 2000 years. And 2000 years after the Pangrave culture, we still find people who practice some of the Pangrave customs, which we'll come to later. This image, as you can see, shown in a closer version, is a cow skull with a painting of a person in typical Egyptian look, except the person looks way more Nubian than usual. And also, you can see that the Pangrave people also could write in ancient Egyptian, at least by this time. No one knows what that writing there says, but given the fact that it's in a rectangle, it's probably a name of something, whether it's the name of the person or the name of the tribe, I have no idea. But we can tell from this that this is a Nubian, and not only that, it's on the skull of a cow. The skull of a cow, a painting on the skull of a cow, how could that possibly be reflecting a specific culture? Well, let's go check. At the skull of a goat, we can see something very, very interesting. If we look here, this is from the Pangraves. We can see from 1900 to 1500 BC that there are paintings reflecting the culture of these people. And what they show is that these people had a custom, a culture of preparing these things probably way before people died and then burying them in these so-called pan graves. The paint, due to the heat, is perfectly preserved. And as you can see, it's also beautifully made in these continuous patterns or these lines where they go from thick red to a small brown, thick red to a small brown, thick red to a small brown, probably reflecting the pottery that you see. You see, the colors are exactly the same. Now, obviously, it's possible that those were just the limited colors that they worked with, as we will see when we look at the colored version of that image. As you can see, typically Nubian, colored with that red and black, and you can see the red and black as well, and it's possible that that red and black is actually symbolic of something. My guess would be maybe the top represents heaven and the bottom represents earth. Who knows? I mean, the blackness of the sky could probably be there, but let's move on from that. But you can see again, very Egyptian. Now, this was buried in the ground. How? Well, let's see. So, as you can see, it's typical of the other tombs that we found 4000 BC. It's circular, and they have the jaws and everything in the middle. But if you look at the sides, right at the bottom at the corner, you can see that there's cattle heads. Now these cattle heads would be encircling this grave, probably for protection, but also as a gift to take to the afterlife. These cattle are coming with you. As you can see, they did not spare any cattle. There are literally maybe 4 or 5 in this picture alone in this small area. So you can imagine how many cattle were sacrificed in order to have it encircle the entire pit. These graves obviously were not done for every single person. In fact, I think they have under 100 of them in various parts of Egypt, some actually located very high in Egypt geographically, and then some located in Sudan. And the reason for this is because this culture is probably a nomadic one. This nomadic culture, which we can tell by other features, which I'll talk about later, is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because the Medjay are thought to be nomadic. The Medjay being that one tribe that I mentioned, the Nubian tribe. We know these guys are Nubian, we know they're nomadic. And so a lot of people, for this reason, associate these people with the Medjay. Little bit of a difference though, because this culture did die out at some point, while the Medjay are still referred to way after this tribe has died out. So it's possible that the Medjay represent a tribe that existed, and it's possible that these guys were part of that tribe. Now, interestingly, there are other graves located close to this area that don't look anything like this, but in fact represent a different type of Nubian style, which I'll talk about at some other time. And in some cases, there are some a little further away that represent Libyan styles, which again we'll talk about in some other time, which shows that there was diversity, meaning geographical diversity, not racial, geographical diversity within this region, meaning there are different tribes that coexisted but did their own thing. This is a top-down view of these pan graves, and you can see they're pretty deep, but you know they're not exactly the deepest. And of course, the stuff that goes down with them are beads and so on. If we compare these two images of obvious Egyptian warriors, we can see a bit of similarities between the two. But let's talk about this one because it's not obvious to a lot of people until you explain that this is a warrior. How do I know? Well, in his hand, he's holding a mace. Clearly, he's holding a stick that he's going to use to beat the hell out of someone. And then on his back, he's got an axe that he is wielding in preparation. He's holding something that looks like a shield, a small shield, almost reflectant of the one that you can see in the Egyptians that is holding. And he doesn't seem to be holding any spears. The person who is here, because he's a warrior, and of course the Medjay are associated with warriors, makes it very easy to make the comparison between the Medjay and this culture. Here is a grouping that was pulled out of the ground of Nubian sheep and goat painted in those similar patterns. Obviously, those patterns and the color arrangement must have meant something to these people. You can see the dotted one, like the ones on the sides and the top, they are striped, and you can see the one in the middle is dotted, but those dots still seem to represent stripes. The reason for this, I have no idea. If we read, the inhabitants of Nubia frequently sacrificed animals for the deceased and deposited the skulls or horns, cores at or near the tomb. These painted sheep and goat skulls were found in a shallow trench in a Pangrave cemetery. Okay, this is beautiful. It works, right? You sacrifice an animal. Various societies around the world have sacrificed animals and they've put them inside graves. This is not something that's strange or odd. The strange part is that they're painted. So let's go through the process, right? If we look at a cow, we can see that there's blood, guts, there's brain, there's all kinds of things inside a cow that would make it very limiting for you to paint their skull. So, what we're looking at here is you get rid of the cow or you get rid of its life, you remove the layer of skin, you remove everything else, and you keep only the skull. And then you clean the skull, and then you wait until the skull is dry and it's ready, and then you paint it. Easy, right? Now, here's the problem. Second problem. How are you going to put it inside a grave? How do you know when someone is dead? Do they do this before or after someone dies? Remember, if they do it before, then they might need to repaint it because it's not in the ground. And so if they have to keep repainting it, that might be a little taxing for the people. Imagine if you prepare these for a man who's 35 years old and he lives another 30 years. Well, it seems like there's a simple solution for that. Don't sacrifice animals for people who are in their 30s. Wait until they're pretty old and then you can sacrifice them. Very simple, right? But how do you know when they're going to die? If someone is 50 years old, and some people have lived that long in history, in fact, a lot of people have lived that long, then you could think, okay, maybe they'll die in 10 years. The problem with that is that what if they don't? Also, even if they do die in 10 years, will the paint still hold on? Will it still be there? Okay, so let's shift it. What if then they do something very different? What if they say, let's not paint the skulls. Let's just save them, put them in a corner somewhere, and basically whenever we eat cattle, whenever we do something like that, we put them in the corner and wait. And then when the people die, then we take them out, paint them, put them in the grave, and then we're done. It's a fair solution. The only problem is it removes the personal touch, and it also would not count really as a sacrifice because it wasn't a sacrifice. It was something that happened a long time ago. It's impersonal. Now maybe they didn't care, and that's possible. And given the number of them, and also the fact that they didn't use the whole body, it's possible that that's exactly what happened. But let's consider the other solution. So let's say the person's dead, then they kill the cattle, and then they go and fetch all the materials to prepare for its burial. It's quite the task, right? Especially given the number. You have maybe about what, like 100 dead cattle. Then you have to start stripping their heads, and then you have to get rid of the gunk, and then you have to wash it and all this other stuff. By the end of it, you're probably looking at a couple days or maybe weeks before you can even bury this person. Now, of course, you could just bury the person first, then dig the trench around and put the cattle around it, which would be a fair solution, but again, removing a ceremonial touch to it where, all things must go in the grave at the same time. Of course, these people showing some warrior skills and all of that must have fought wars, right? You don't really portray someone with an axe and a mace if they didn't fight wars. And interestingly, because of Upper Egypt, where a lot of these other characters came from, even some of the earlier kings came from, it's possible that this group represents one of the groups that collided together with Egypt earlier, but this side of it stayed in its tribal ways while the others fused with Egypt. And then later, these ones fused with Egypt, and I wouldn't say died, but they got removed as a culture.
Middle coma, and then the classic coma phases of Upper Nubia. And this is what my whole in-between project is about. My Funerary project is looking at what is going on with these various Nubian traditions that are all active in and around the same place at the same time. How do they interact with each other? How do they impact each other? Do they impact each other at all? And how might they be related socially and culturally? But it goes to show how multicultural and dynamic this period was, the Second Intermediate period was in Egypt and Nubia. They are best recognized, the Pangrave tradition, I should say, is best recognized by its material culture. They are, as far as we can tell, a non-literate society or non-literate culture. And so their objects are the only way that we have to get to who these people are. There is a very distinct style to their objects, but there is a lot of variation, and we'll go into that shortly. But they are most easily recognized by things like their pottery, which is characterized by either this black top decoration, and you'll see here that it's got a very neat, defined black top. That's quite a marker of the Pangrave tradition. And also by this very simple but quite intricate incised decoration in linear geometric designs. They are also recognized by these, what we call plaque beads or spacer beads made of mother of pearl, which were worn around the wrists and the arms, in any other Nubian traditions during the time. So it's like they're a marker, I guess, for this group. The most distinctive and visually striking things, I think, are these painted animal skulls, which were deposited above and around Pangrave burials, or some Pangrave burials, usually cows, goats, or sheep. Always, usually, the frontal bones at the top of the animal's head where the horns attached. It was never the whole skull, it was just that section, or the horns themselves. And they were often painted in these red and black designs, which are quite graphic and striking. They have a very wide distribution across Egypt and Nubia. Their cemeteries, though, are most densely concentrated around the Nile Valley of Upper Egypt and Lower Nubia, which you can see here in this dark red section on this map. But there are also a few settlement contexts scattered around mostly Egypt and some of Lower Nubia, which may be Pangrave campsites, but the finds are quite ephemeral, so it's sort of hard to know. But
We've talked about their skulls that they used to paint, and I think that's an important part that he just reminded me. The fact that they preserve the horns on it as well. I don't know why I didn't mention that earlier, but they did preserve the horns, which is probably makes it that much more difficult, especially since you're going to bury it, to make sure that the horn does not break. So you can imagine that the graves were delicately buried and they were quietly, not quietly, they were preserved in a way where people weren't around allowed to run around them and stuff like that. So these graves are very, very good. And here's another thing, they're preserved for a very long time. It's possible that some of the people would still know about them hundreds of years after the people are dead, so they know not to disturb them. And given, Egypt and Nubia, we know that these people probably didn't do anything like that. Now, of course, we can talk about the pottery that appears there, which there's a lot, but as the speaker points out in one of his videos, he points out that in Egypt, the proper Egypt, there seems to be mass production of pottery to the point where you get ostracan. You get all kinds of pots that just get thrown away in dumps that we find today that help us understand mistakes they made, or even graffiti that is drawn on pottery and then it's thrown in a grave, used as maybe, to try something out. But these people seem to preserve pottery no matter what, even if the pottery is shattered or even if the pottery is worn down. They seem to preserve everything. They're not a very wasteful culture.
It suggests that there isn't a differentiation, at least in this group of Pangrave people, or maybe in the Pangrave tradition more generally, that there isn't much of a differentiation between funerary and everyday pottery, and that there wasn't pottery made specifically for funerary purposes and so on and so forth, which is probably not unexpected. But even more telling is this sherd down here, which the arrow is pointing to, which has repair holes. And there's these two little holes that you can see near the rim and then a bit further down on the edge of this vessel or the edge of the sherd. Those are half of what would have been a repair. So the pot would have broken, and then the adjoining piece that would have gone here would have had corresponding holes. They would have put a piece of sinew or something in between there to pull the pieces together. And as that sinew dried, it would have pulled the pieces tightly and put the vessel back together. So what this tells me is that this vessel was used in life. So it was made to be used. It wasn't intended just to go into a grave, which again supports this idea that there was no difference between funerary and everyday pottery types. But it also then tells me things about Pangrave ceramic ecologies and economies, and also maybe their belief systems as well. So by ceramic economy, I mean that it suggests that pottery was valuable. In ancient Egypt, for anyone who's worked on an Egyptian site or an Egyptian settlement site, you will know that pottery is dumped by the ton. So in Egypt, where pottery is produced on a mass, almost industrial scale, if you like, if a pot broke, you just throw it away and got a new one. But here in the Pangrave tradition, they don't. And I've seen this quite often where there are repair holes on a lot of Nubian sherds, not just on Pangrave, but where they go to an effort to repair the pots.
So, what does this tell us about Egypt and Nubia in general? Well, it tells us that the Nubians are not one tribe. It also tells us that the Pangrave people were somewhat a little more different than the other Nubians in that they took more care when it came to building some of their stuff. And it also means that they had a different culture with the cattle, because if you find in other places in Nubia and lower Nubia and upper Nubia and even as far down as the deep Sudanese areas, which would later also be seen as the Nubian regions by later people, the people deep to the south, Kerman stuff, they would sacrifice like 5,000 cattle. No one's cleaning those. They're just putting them in the graves. They're going through ritual, but they're not putting them the way, taking as much care as these people are. These people seem to be very neat in their approaches. And also, they seem to have lended or lent, depending what country you come from. They clearly have put some of their culture or taken some of their culture and given it to the Egyptians, both in pottery and probably burial styles and burial thought, ritual thought.
Then we have to think about, okay, how have we got two contemporary sites at opposite ends of the Cana Bend that are both Pangrave cemeteries that have very similar compositions in terms of their Nubian material culture and Egyptian material culture? And looking through the evidence and looking through doing a bit of research, I found that there is in fact a road called the Farshut Road that cuts across the Cana Bend. You can see it here on this map. And it leaves from Thebes or the west bank of the Nile near Luxor, which is a couple of hours walk from Armont. And from there, you cut across the desert via the Wadi al-Hol, and the road passes through Hu, where there is the other early Pangrave cemetery of the late Middle Kingdom. The road then continues on to the oases of the Western Desert. There is also Pangrave-style pottery, cooking pottery in settlement contexts in the Western Desert oases. There is also rock art at Wadi al-Hol that John Darnell has connected with Nubian traditions and Nubian cultural heritage. So is it then, can we then start to piece together that Armont was part of this network of Nubian peoples who had lived in and around the Kano Bend and were moving across the desert in the bend of the Nile during the late Middle Kingdom?
To cement how different some of the cultures located in the region, let's take Wadi al Hal because he gave us that as an example. Wadi al Hal, in the same period as this culture existed. So this culture, 1850 BC to about, 500 years after that, this culture existed. But 1900 BC to about 1500 BC, we see this, which I don't know if it looks like Proto Sinaitic script. So we see a culture that is creating alphabet right next to a culture that probably only learned to write later in its history. And obviously, when it did, it probably went with it. And again, it's the Medjay. The Medjay are thought to be the people who moved in and became these people. Why is that important? The reason is because of integration. See, these people seem like they got integrated into Egyptian culture. So this is why I say transition rather than decaying culture. The culture seems to have joined within the culture of the ancient Egyptians. As you can see there, the word Medjay, meaning police, which was one of the jobs that a lot of these people were employed for, the Medjay. There's tons of writing that show that the Medjay were being used for the most part as police with their dogs, the the Basenji dogs that you will see them traveling with, but and holding weapons and stuff and being and holding power along the areas and also being nomadic in their history. You can see here that these people might be the same. It might be the exact same culture because they shift, and it's admitted by the Egyptians that the Medjay are Nubian, but they shift from being Nubian to being fully Egyptian, and not only that, serving purposes that are fully for Egyptian sake. Obviously, they still exist in a Nubian type of way, and they still exist in some ways as nomadic. As you can see here, another word, this H and W, meaning a person of the Medjay. As you can see, it reflects that these people are, how do you put this? They're easily identifiable to the point where the word Medjay doesn't just mean any cop of any kind, whether they be Canaanite or anything, but specifically these tribes. Now, of course, maybe we're jumping the gun by saying they Medjay, but they fit the description. And a lot of times we need more evidence for this stuff to be true. Now, every place that I saw from a lot of research papers seem to just conclude that they are the Medjay. I've seen some of them as well say, nah, they're probably not. But we will probably find further evidence later on that will separate for us whether or not they are. But in conclusion, you can see that Nubians, the Nahesi, the Medjay, are not all the same. And their technological skills are not always the same. You have some Nubians that I'll talk about some other time who are very literate, who write all the time. And of course, some other time we have to talk about Punt and we have to talk about Libya. But I was going to do Libya, but I realized the Nubians deserve more than one video.